The most devastating lie of our time masquerades as compassion. Having spent decades treating patients in Britain's most deprived areas and examining criminals in Her Majesty's prisons, I've witnessed a cruel paradox that would shock those who champion helping the poor. The very policies designed to alleviate poverty have become sophisticated machines for manufacturing and perpetuating it. This isn't theoretical speculation from an ivory tower, it's empirical observation from the front lines of human misery. What I've seen challenges everything our benevolent elites tell us about poverty. The welfare state, celebrated as civilization's triumph over want, has achieved something far more sinister. It has created a permanent underclass dependent on the very system that supposedly liberates them. The most tragic irony? Those who most loudly proclaim their concern for the poor live comfortably insulated from the consequences of their compassionate cruelty. Today, I'll share what 25 years of clinical observation has taught me about how genuine help differs fundamentally from the sentimental policies that destroy the people they claim to save. Chapter 1: The Welfare Trap: How Charity Becomes Cruelty. In my years working in a hospital serving one of Britain's most impoverished districts, I encountered a phenomenon that defied everything I'd been taught about poverty alleviation. Patients would arrive with complaints that revealed not material deprivation, but spiritual and moral emptiness that no amount of government assistance could fill. A young woman, pregnant with her fourth child by her third partner, explained matter-of-factly that having another baby would increase her housing benefit. She displayed no shame, no concern for the children's welfare, only the calculated opportunism of someone who had learned to game a system designed to help her. This wasn't an isolated case. I observed pattern after pattern of behavior that revealed how welfare dependency had fundamentally altered the relationship between effort and reward. When basic needs are guaranteed regardless of personal conduct, when housing, food, and income arrive automatically without corresponding responsibility, something profound dies in the human spirit. The welfare state had achieved what no oppressive regime could accomplish. It had made dependency comfortable, even profitable. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the material dependence, but the psychological transformation I witnessed. Patients spoke of work as something for other people, as if productive employment were an alien concept rather than the natural human condition. They had been systematically taught that society owed them a living, that their circumstances resulted entirely from forces beyond their control. This learned helplessness wasn't accidental, it was the inevitable consequence of policies that treated symptoms while ignoring causes. Consider the housing system I observed firsthand. Young women discovered they could obtain independent accommodation immediately upon becoming pregnant, something impossible for their working contemporaries saving for years to afford rent. The perverse incentive was unmistakable. Pregnancy became a route to instant housing, encouraging precisely the behaviors that perpetuate poverty across generations. The children born from these arrangements entered a world where adult responsibility was optional, where the state would provide regardless of their parents' choices. What struck me most profoundly was how this system corrupted natural human instincts. Parents lost the pride that comes from providing for their families through their own efforts. Children grew up never witnessing the dignity of work, the satisfaction of achievement, or the connection between effort and reward. The welfare state had created not just material dependency, but moral and psychological dependency that proved far more destructive than any material hardship. The tragedy deepened when I realized that those administering these policies, social workers, housing officials, benefit assessors, genuinely believed they were helping. They had created a bureaucratic paradise that measured success by the number of people receiving assistance rather than the number achieving independence. The system's very existence depended on maintaining the problems it claimed to solve. Chapter 2: Cultural Destruction: When Low Expectations Become Self-Fulfilling Prophecies. The welfare state's most insidious achievement wasn't creating material dependency. It was systematically destroying the cultural foundations that enable people to escape poverty. In my clinical work, I observed how progressive policies had gradually eroded the very attitudes and behaviors that allow individuals to improve their circumstances. Where previous generations of the poor maintained dignity, aspiration, and moral standards despite material hardship, the modern welfare system had cultivated cultures of excuse-making, immediate gratification, and moral relativism. I remember examining a teenager whose vocabulary consisted largely of expletives, who had never opened a book, and who considered education for others. When I suggested that reading might expand his opportunities, he looked at me with genuine bewilderment. His environment had taught him that intellectual development was unnecessary, the state would provide regardless of his efforts or abilities. This wasn't ignorance born of lack of opportunity, it was willful ignorance encouraged by a system that made intellectual development seem pointless. The destruction of aesthetic standards proved equally devastating. In previous generations, even the poorest families maintained standards of dress, speech, and behavior that reflected their aspirations for something better. The modern welfare state had eliminated this pressure for self-improvement by making comfort achievable without effort. I watched as patients arrived at hospital wearing pajamas in public, speaking in grunts rather than sentences, displaying no awareness that their presentation affected how others perceived and treated them. Most tragically, I observed the systematic destruction of delayed gratification, perhaps the most crucial psychological capacity for escaping poverty. When every want can be satisfied immediately through credit, benefits, or theft, why develop the painful discipline of saving and planning? Patients would spend their entire monthly benefit within days, then complain of hardship while surrounded by expensive electronics purchased impulsively. They had been trained to live in perpetual present, incapable of the forward thinking that enables economic advancement. The sexual revolution, celebrated as liberation, had proven particularly destructive for the poor. When I began practicing medicine, even in impoverished areas, most children grew up in stable two-parent households. By the time I retired, such arrangements had become rare curiosities. The welfare state had made marriage economically unnecessary for women. Indeed, it often penalized stable partnerships. Children grew up never witnessing functional adult relationships, never learning that commitment and sacrifice were possible or valuable. Perhaps most perniciously, the culture of victimhood had replaced the culture of personal responsibility. Patients would recite elaborate explanations for their circumstances that invariably blamed external forces, racism, lack of opportunities, government failures, social injustice. While some of these factors undoubtedly existed, the systematic cultivation of victimhood prevented individuals from recognizing the areas where they retained control and could affect change. The welfare state had achieved something remarkable. It had convinced people that powerlessness was their natural condition. Chapter 3: The Incentive Structure: How Good Intentions Create Perverse Outcomes. Let me invite you to examine something that most refuse to acknowledge: how supposedly compassionate policies systematically reward destructive behaviors while punishing productive ones. In my years observing welfare recipients, I witnessed the creation of an incentive structure so perverse it could hardly have been designed more effectively to perpetuate poverty if that had been its explicit goal. Consider the young mothers I encountered who had learned to manipulate the system with remarkable sophistication. They understood precisely which behaviors would maximize their benefits. Remaining unmarried ensured higher payments than marriage, additional children meant increased housing allowances, maintaining the appearance of depression or anxiety could secure disability benefits, claiming their children had behavioral problems brought educational support payments. These women weren't lazy or stupid, they were responding rationally to the incentives their government had created. The system punished every positive behavior that traditionally helped people escape poverty. Taking part-time work often resulted in benefit reductions that made employment economically irrational. Saving money could disqualify families from assistance programs. Marriage frequently reduced overall household income compared to remaining unmarried. Educational achievement brought no immediate rewards, while maintaining victim status ensured continued support. The welfare state had created an economic environment where self-improvement was penalized and dependency was rewarded. I observed this perverse logic most clearly in housing policy. Young people who worked, saved responsibly, and delayed parenthood found themselves unable to afford independent accommodation, forced to live with parents or share cramped quarters with strangers. Meanwhile, their contemporaries who became pregnant immediately qualified for subsidized housing. The message was unmistakable: irresponsibility was rewarded with independence, while responsibility brought continued dependence on family or private landlords charging market rates. The employment services revealed similarly destructive incentives. Recipients learned to attend mandatory job search appointments while ensuring they wouldn't actually find work, arriving late, dressing inappropriately, or expressing preferences so narrow that employment became impossible. The system required the appearance of seeking work while making actual employment economically disadvantageous. Bureaucrats measured success by compliance with procedures rather than by helping people achieve independence. Most insidiously, the system encouraged family breakdown by making single parenthood more profitable than stable partnerships. Women discovered they could maximize benefits by remaining unmarried while maintaining relationships with men who officially lived elsewhere. Children grew up in households where deception was necessary for survival, where the presence of a father figure had to be hidden from authorities. The welfare state had criminalized normal family arrangements while rewarding their dissolution. The disability system provided perhaps the starkest example of perverse incentives. I encountered numerous patients who had learned to exaggerate or maintain symptoms to qualify for benefits. Recovery became financially dangerous. Getting better meant losing income. The system created powerful incentives to remain sick, to resist treatment, to cultivate chronic victimhood rather than pursue healing. Doctors became unwitting accomplices in this charade, pressured to provide diagnoses that justified continued payments rather than focus on actual treatment. Chapter 4: The Sentimentalism of Elites, When Compassion Becomes Cruelty. The most maddening aspect of observing welfare dependency wasn't the behavior of recipients; they were responding rationally to irrational incentives, but the willful blindness of the educated classes who designed and defended these destructive policies. Having worked in both private practice serving affluent areas and public hospitals serving the poor, I witnessed a stark disconnect between the compassionate theories of the wealthy and the brutal realities experienced by the supposed beneficiaries of their benevolence. The middle-class social workers, university professors, and government officials who championed expanded welfare programs lived in comfortable suburbs where the consequences of their policies never intruded. Their own children attended good schools, grew up in stable families, and learned the values of delayed gratification and personal responsibility. Yet these same people advocated policies for the poor that they would never accept for their own families. They promoted single parenthood as lifestyle choice, while ensuring their own children grew up with both parents present. This sentimental compassion proved far more cruel than honest acknowledgement of difficult truths. When I suggested to colleagues that unlimited welfare might be counterproductive, I was accused of lacking compassion. When I pointed out that removing consequences for irresponsible behavior might encourage more irresponsible behavior, I was labeled heartless. The defenders of destructive policies had made criticism of their methods tantamount to hatred of the poor, a rhetorical strategy that insulated their programs from honest evaluation. The most pernicious aspect of elite sentimentalism was its focus on intentions rather than results. Policymakers measured their moral worth by the compassion of their proposals rather than the effectiveness of their outcomes. Expanding benefits felt generous, regardless of whether such expansion actually helped recipients achieve independence. Lowering standards seemed inclusive, regardless of whether such lowering prepared students for real-world success. The emotional satisfaction of appearing caring took precedence over the mundane work of actually improving lives. I observed this dynamic repeatedly in hospital settings where middle-class staff would express shock at patient behaviors that had become routine in welfare-dependent communities. A nurse from an affluent background would encounter a patient who had never held a job, who couldn't read simple instructions, whose children had different fathers, and rather than recognizing these as symptoms of failed social policies, would attribute them to insufficient government assistance. The solution was always more of what had created the problem in the first place. The language of elite compassion revealed its fundamental dishonesty. They spoke of investing in people when they meant creating dependency. They described empowerment when they meant removing agency and responsibility. They celebrated diversity when they meant accepting dysfunction as culturally authentic. This linguistic manipulation prevented honest discussion of what was actually happening in welfare-dependent communities. Perhaps most tellingly, when these policies produced predictable negative outcomes, increased crime, family breakdown, educational failure, the elite response was never to question their fundamental assumptions, but to demand more resources for more of the same interventions. They had created a system that benefited everyone except its supposed beneficiaries. Bureaucrats gained job security, politicians gained votes from grateful recipients, and the middle class gained the psychological satisfaction of appearing compassionate while their own lives remained unaffected by the chaos they had unleashed. Chapter 5: The Language of Deception: How Words Hide Reality. Let me invite you to notice something: how systematically the language surrounding poverty has been corrupted to prevent honest analysis of what actually helps or harms the poor. In my clinical work, I observed not just behavioral changes among welfare recipients, but linguistic changes that revealed how thoroughly progressive ideology had penetrated their thinking, and how these linguistic changes actively prevented them from understanding their own situations. The most obvious example was the disappearance of personal agency from discussions of poverty. Patients no longer spoke of what they had done or could do to improve their circumstances. Instead, they had learned a vocabulary of victimhood that attributed all negative outcomes to external forces: society, the system, lack of opportunities, racism, disadvantage. This wasn't merely description. It was a form of learned helplessness reinforced by every interaction with social services. Social workers and benefits assessors had been trained in this same corrupted language. They spoke of clients rather than patients, emphasizing a commercial relationship rather than a medical or therapeutic one. They described dependency as support, making permanent assistance sound like temporary help. They referred to able-bodied people as disabled based on increasingly broad definitions that included feeling sad or anxious. Every linguistic choice obscured rather than clarified the actual nature of the problems being addressed. The education system proved particularly adept at linguistic manipulation. Schools serving welfare-dependent communities stopped failing students, instead celebrating different learning styles and diverse achievements. Teachers were forbidden from correcting speech patterns that would limit students' employment prospects, lest they appear judgmental. Academic standards were continuously lowered while the language suggested they were being made more inclusive. Students graduated functionally illiterate while everyone spoke of their success. Criminal justice adopted similar euphemisms. Theft became antisocial behavior. Assault became conflict resolution issues. Drug dealing became informal economic activity. By removing moral language from discussions of obviously immoral behavior, the system prevented both perpetrators and victims from understanding what was actually happening. How could problems be solved when they couldn't be honestly named? The medical profession, where I spent my career, gradually abandoned diagnostic precision in favor of therapeutic language designed to avoid stigma. Alcoholism became substance abuse disorder. Laziness became motivational challenges. Irresponsibility became executive function deficits. While this linguistic softening might have felt compassionate, it prevented patients from understanding the relationship between their choices and their outcomes. Most insidiously, the language of rights had been expanded to include claims on other people's labor and resources. Patients spoke of their right to housing, healthcare, education, and income, without any corresponding discussion of duties or responsibilities. This linguistic inflation created a sense of entitlement that made gratitude impossible and self-improvement unnecessary. If everything good was already their right, why work to achieve it? The corrupted language spread beyond welfare recipients to the broader culture. Journalists wrote about child poverty when they meant parental irresponsibility. Politicians spoke of investing in communities when they meant subsidizing dysfunction. Academics discussed structural inequality when they meant the predictable consequences of destructive behaviors. The systematic corruption of language made honest analysis impossible and ensured that destructive policies would continue indefinitely. Chapter 6: The Moral Vacuum, When Relativism Destroys Standards. During my years treating patients in welfare-dependent communities, I witnessed something that shocked me more than material deprivation: the complete collapse of moral standards that had once enabled even the poorest families to maintain dignity and aspiration. The progressive embrace of moral relativism, celebrated as tolerance and inclusivity, had created a moral vacuum that proved devastating for those least equipped to navigate life without clear guidelines. The most striking example was the attitude toward honesty I encountered among patients. Lying to authorities had become so normalized that many seemed genuinely confused when I suggested it might be problematic. They had learned to lie to benefits officers about their living arrangements, to doctors about their symptoms, to teachers about their children's circumstances, and to employers about their qualifications. This wasn't seen as moral failure but as practical necessity, indeed, as evidence of their cleverness in navigating the system. The collapse of sexual morality proved equally devastating. When I began practicing, even in poor communities, there remained shame associated with illegitimate pregnancy and serial relationships. By the end of my career, such shame had been systematically eliminated as judgmental. Young women spoke casually of having children with multiple partners, of relationships that lasted weeks or months, of sexual activity beginning in early adolescence. They had been taught that moral standards were oppressive rather than protective. This moral relativism had practical consequences that the poor couldn't escape as easily as their middle-class champions. When marriage became merely one lifestyle choice among many, children lost the stability that had traditionally helped families escape poverty. When academic achievement became just one form of intelligence, students lost motivation to develop the skills employers actually wanted. When criminal behavior became merely different life choices, communities lost the safety that made economic development possible. The most cruel irony was that moral relativism was practiced selectively. The same social workers who refused to judge their clients' destructive behaviors applied rigorous moral standards to anyone who questioned these policies. The same teachers who celebrated diverse learning styles that excused illiteracy imposed strict speech codes that punished politically incorrect language. The same politicians who described crime as cry for help demanded harsh punishment for tax evasion or regulatory violations. I observed how this moral confusion affected children most devastatingly. They grew up in environments where adults refused to distinguish between right and wrong, where every behavior was explained away as product of circumstances, where moral guidance was dismissed as oppression. These children developed no internal moral compass, no sense of shame to inhibit destructive behaviors, no pride to motivate constructive ones. They became moral invalids, dependent on external control because they had never developed internal discipline. The therapeutic culture that replaced moral standards proved particularly destructive. Instead of teaching right from wrong, adults taught children to express their feelings. Instead of developing character through overcoming difficulties, they learned to seek professional help for every emotional challenge. Instead of accepting responsibility for their actions, They learned to find psychological explanations that absolved them of guilt. This therapeutic approach created emotional invalids as surely as welfare created economic invalids. Perhaps most tragically, the elimination of moral standards removed one of the few resources that had traditionally helped the poor transcend their circumstances. Throughout history, strong moral convictions had enabled individuals to resist the corrupting influences of poverty, to maintain dignity despite material hardship, to aspire to something better for their children. Progressive policies had systematically destroyed these internal resources while offering no effective external replacements. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Restoring Human Agency and Responsibility. Having diagnosed the disease, let me suggest the cure, though I warn you it requires abandoning comfortable illusions for uncomfortable truths. My decades of clinical observation have convinced me that genuine help for the poor must begin with restoring what progressive policies have systematically destroyed: personal agency, moral standards, and the connection between choices and consequences. The first step is recognizing that material assistance alone never solves poverty. It may even perpetuate it when divorced from corresponding expectations and responsibilities. Truly helping the poor requires helping them develop the internal resources that enable self-improvement, delayed gratification, moral discipline, educational aspiration, and pride in productive work. These qualities cannot be distributed like welfare checks. They must be cultivated through experience and example. This means fundamentally restructuring welfare to reward movement toward independence rather than comfortable dependency. Benefits should decrease over time rather than increase, creating urgency for recipients to develop alternative sources of support. Work requirements should be genuinely enforced, not bureaucratically evaded. Educational standards should be raised rather than lowered, preparing students for real employment rather than managing their feelings about failure. Most importantly, we must restore the expectation that adults are responsible for their choices and their consequences. This means ending the systematic excuse-making that has become standard social work practice. It means holding parents accountable for their children's behavior rather than blaming schools or society. It means treating criminal behavior as moral failure rather than social symptom. It means demanding that recipients of public assistance demonstrate movement towards self-sufficiency. The family structure must be restored as the foundation of healthy communities. This requires ending policies that financially reward family breakdown and beginning policies that support stable marriages. It means acknowledging that children need fathers as well as mothers, that stable relationships benefit everyone involved, that sexual restraint serves practical as well as moral purposes. The welfare state must stop penalizing marriage and start supporting it. Educational reform must focus on actual learning rather than emotional management. Schools serving poor communities need higher standards, not lower ones. Students need rigorous academic instruction, not therapeutic intervention for every difficulty. Teachers must be allowed to fail students who haven't mastered material, to enforce behavioral standards that prepare children for adult employment, to teach the knowledge and skills that enable economic advancement. Community standards must be enforced rather than relativized. This means acknowledging that some behaviors are destructive regardless of cultural explanations, that some lifestyle choices produce better outcomes than others, that moral standards serve protective rather than oppressive functions. Communities must regain the right to expect civilized behavior from their members. The role of religious institutions and traditional voluntary organizations must be restored and strengthened. These institutions provided the moral framework and practical support that enabled previous generations to escape poverty. They combined material assistance with moral guidance, creating communities of mutual support and shared values that government programs cannot replicate. Finally, we must abandon the sentimentalism that mistakes good intentions for good results. Genuine compassion requires helping people develop the capabilities they need for independence, even when this involves short-term discomfort or difficulty. It means caring more about actual outcomes than about appearing caring. It means recognizing that the highest form of help is making help unnecessary. Conclusion. The uncomfortable truth I've shared contradicts everything our compassionate elites tell us about poverty, but it aligns perfectly with what anyone can observe if they look honestly at the results of progressive policies. After 25 years of treating the supposed beneficiaries of our generous welfare state, I can say with clinical certainty, the system designed to help the poor has become their greatest obstacle to improvement. The path forward requires courage to acknowledge that good intentions aren't enough, that effective help often looks harsh to sentimental observers, that genuine compassion sometimes requires saying no to immediate requests in service of long-term improvement. It requires recognizing that the poor are not different from everyone else in their need for purpose, responsibility, and moral structure. Most importantly, it requires understanding that human dignity comes not from being supported by others, but from supporting oneself and one's family through honest effort. The welfare state has systematically destroyed this dignity while claiming to protect it. True reform means restoring the connection between effort and reward, between choice and consequence, between responsibility and respect. The alternative is continuing down our current path toward a permanent underclass dependent on an ever-expanding state, living lives of comfortable meaninglessness while their supposed helpers congratulate themselves on their compassion. The choice is ours. We can continue the cruel kindness that destroys human potential, or we can embrace the kind cruelty that enables human flourishing. The poor deserve better than our pity. They deserve the opportunity to discover their own strength.